Hi everyone, it's Alex, and the title of this video is a joke. There are even more books than what I could really fit into the thumbnail, so I'll list all the books that I read throughout April and May in the description box below. I also won't be talking about the Overstory, the Great Believers, Eileen, or the Pisces, since I already did reviews or something like that for past videos, even though I did read those in April and May. But as a jumping point, sort of how to group all these books together, I'm trying to do them sort of by mini groups, sort of like those videos. So for example, with like Eileen and the Pisces, a book or two books that I thought of that I'll be talking about first are ones that I think people might enjoy if they liked those two books as well. And one of those books is Severance by Ling Ma, and this is a story about a girl, I would say in her late 20s or mid 20s, named Candace, and she's Chinese American, and we find her in a place, or a couple of different places, as we find out about the present and the past. In the present, we know that Candace is actually amidst a apocalypse for something called Shen fever. But in the past, we know that Candace, she's worked in publishing, but she's also very interested in photography. And really, I think with this book, it's definitely with the mentality of sort of challenging a capitalist framework. And Severance is marketed as a satire, so I can totally get where it's coming from, where even amidst this apocalypse, we do find out things like the survivors that Candace is a part of, they do seek refuge in a mall, and even Candace lists all these brands so repeatedly it sort of gets in your mind how senseless, or how these brands don't even feel like things anymore. They just feel like senseless words. And so with keeping this sort of theme in mind, I think it's really interesting that Candace works in different mediums that might challenge your traditional sort of career, like working in publishing or with writing, and then also her interest in photography. I think those two mediums try to project very specific perceptions of Candace's life, especially being Chinese American. And I think this book, it really asks you, where does culture come from? Because as Candace talks about the past and with her family specifically, a lot of things hit home for me, being Asian American, and sort of trying to wonder what makes me feel more American, and what makes me feel more tied to my heritage. Even more so with Asian cultures in general, or at least thinking of the Philippines where my mom's from, there is this much more collectivist society, whereas here in the States, it's much more individualistic. So I think Candace also really struggles with that, literally within this veil of an apocalypse, and how you can't be individualistic. You have to switch and be collectivist and rely on people. So that's so interesting, I think, what Ling Ma is doing. I don't know if it's as deliberate as I would have maybe liked. I think the book kind of like bumbles around and sort of meanders sometimes, but I would definitely check this book out. I think it's refreshing. I think it is trying to do something, and I really enjoyed reading it. So while there's no apocalypse in this next book, it is just as distressing, and probably the most depressing book I've read in a very long time, or to recent memory, and that is The New Me by Halle Butler. This is a story of a woman in her, I would say, early 30s, and her name is Millie, and really all Millie is trying to do is hold down these temp jobs, although she simultaneously manages to underwhelm people with her performance and her personality, while also creating this sense of distance that feels accidental on her part, but makes people feel pity for her instead of sympathy. Millie does come from a well-off family. She's very supported by her parents, although I would still define Millie as this very ambitious person. She doesn't really, I would say, flaunt her wealth, although she may spend it a bit recklessly. Millie really surprises me as a character, that she wasn't this sort of self-deprecating, sort of superior character to people that are her supervisors in her jobs. She really feels like she genuinely wants to improve and find reasons how to. Most specifically, where she is having trouble with work and work relationships. she does speak very professionally. There's a whole chapter where Millie sends out these really professional emails trying to explain herself and try to reach out for help. So reading the book kind of confused me because I thought the whole time that the problem would be Millie's personality, and that's the reason things weren't working out for her. But specifically with this email chapter that I just talked about, I think it really emphasizes how when we grow up, we're met with this sort of quality of life that can be exhausting and so performative, where we realize we have to learn how to adapt to situations. And there's so many things beyond our control. And I think that's reiterated in this book, as mainly the focus or narration is from Millie, but we do get sort of this outside perspective from Millie's coworkers and how they sort of look at her very subjectively, and again, how they sort of pity her. But at the same time, how these characters, when we get their point of view, they're not very far off from becoming someone like Millie. And I think that's the whole point of this book, is that everyone that we get these small vignettes from, they're so afraid of becoming Millie, and as a reader, I'm certainly afraid of becoming her as well. Between the new me and Severance, there is this very direct sort of concept of how can I be useful, whether it was Candace in Severance and how she's in this apocalyptic situation, or Millie, who literally is taking every chance she can, sending out resumes, sending emails to temp agencies that will not reply to her no matter how professional her speaking is. It's just sort of this emptiness that really gets at you to sort of wonder, what control do I have and how can I manage and get by? And it's an awful feeling. So moving on to another book that features a young 20, 30-something woman and someone that's very career-driven is Alice, who's an editorial assistant in the book Asymmetry by Lisa Halliday. Apart from Millie in The New Me, Alice is a bit fortunate as she meets this sort of prolific writer by the name of Ezra, and he sort of takes her under his wing and teaches her about his career. But really all they do is just talk a lot, and that's the first part of Asymmetry because there are 3 parts. The second part of Asymmetry features a story about a man named Jafari as he's detained in the Heathrow airport, and the third part of this book cycles back to Ezra and a sort of interview style prose that talks about Ezra's writing and also a bit about Alice herself. If I could sum up this book in its entirety, I know a lot of people have differing opinions on it. I thought it was very fun to read. I don't think necessarily I enjoyed the entire content of the book. I think I enjoyed the experience as a whole. It's kind of like putting a puzzle together. Although with the 3 parts, there isn't really anything that you're obligated or feel responsible for figuring out. It's not entirely necessary, which to me I think was a relief. Because so often I think what this book is trying to say is that as readers, we often try to find a lot of the time meaning in words and meanings in story. But I think this book is trying to make you more conscious of that action. And apart from us as readers, what's sort of the responsibility or the goal of the writer? And that's most, I think, portrayed through Alice and with Ezra, as we'll find out throughout the story. But even in this third part with this interview style, even that feels so performative to sort of make you wonder, can we really trust the writer? Because they're in just as much control as we are to the ones reading their work. And thinking further on that writer and reader relationship, I think this book does a really good job at asking yourself, is everything we write possibly unconsciously autobiographical? And that's actually is sort of own meta sort of comment on Lisa Halliday herself and her relationship with writers in her real life, which I feel like she was trying to emulate or put in this book. And then also you have to sort of wonder, does every sort of text we're approached with as readers, does it have to be some sort of form of self-reflection? And I think how those 2 ideas mesh, I think this book does a really good job at that. So again, I definitely enjoyed the ride of this book. I think if I only just try to solely read it from like an enjoyable reading, leisurely experience, I may not have liked it, or I wouldn't recommend it as much. So now moving on to another video I did about the Pulitzer Prize and Pulitzer books. I've already talked about the Overstory and the Great Believers that I read throughout April and May, and so now I'm moving on to sort of other Pulitzer books, and that one of them, which I mentioned briefly, was Tinkers by Paul Harding. This is a generational family story, so we open with George Washington Crosby, who's on his deathbed, and he's recounting these memories about his life, and sort of the book is about the intimacy of memory. Because when you think about it, with memory so often, we might like put them in a special place for us, but usually it's all happening within our mind anyway. We don't too often get to talk out loud about those experiences, and how every living moment you have, even thinking of yesterday, that's already a memory, and they're all on the same wavelength or same level of how it becomes just used by that word, memory. So while we have George, it's not just about him, but also, again, this whole family, generations, and I think the whole time this book is trying to let these people that take turns narrating convince themselves that memories are special, and how it's so unconscious that we do that, and how do we determine which memories we keep and which ones we don't value as much. And so because of that, this book does like get access to feeling very poetic, using very fragmented language. And it's totally what I'm a sucker for. This book totally reminded me of things like Housekeeping by Marilyn Robinson, which I love. And the characters here, I think, are fine in Tinkers. I think they're sort of used more as avenues for Harding to sort of use the type of poetic language that he seems to like to use. But yeah, I don't have a lot to say about this book. I thought it was nice. It's just something in my wheelhouse, so I know I would enjoy it. I don't know if I'd recommend it to everybody, but definitely check it out if you're into this sort of small town, small family sort of structure, and how things come and go, memories reveal themselves, etc. So another Pulitzer book about family that I did not like really at all was the Poisonwood Bible. This is a story about a religious family going to Africa and really just trying to introduce spirituality to these people that live there. This book is fine. It's just, it was so traditional to me. It's like a book I probably wouldn't read because I feel like its themes are too explicit. We have narration from these daughters of this family and also the mother, and it was just so reflecty all the time. And halfway through the book, there's this turn that happens where I rolled my eyes. And the book didn't surprise me at all. It was just so, at times, even boring. I don't know, I just didn't get it. I've read Kingsolver before, but this book just didn't feel new, at least with things I've read already in my reading life. It just felt like it was there, and that was it. That's when I finished it. So, moving on to more positive things, now moving on to maybe books I've mentioned in a really old Friday Reads video that I did in the beginning of April. I wanted to talk about A Single Man by Christopher Isherwood. This story takes place in the 1960s, and we follow George, who's an English professor, although very early on, we learn of the tragedy of the death of his lover, who's revealed to be a man. So with this book, it is LGBTQ themed, and I love how in the beginning we already get this death, because we don't have to really work ourselves up to this sense of revealing that George might have to go through. Instead, George has to cross the next hurdle, which is adapting, not only to his grief with the death of his lover, but also just now reshaping his life and his identity and his persona now that his lover has passed. Especially for George, having these sort of masculine traits that he brings up, such as his role as an English professor at this school, and also just talking about a car he really likes to drive around the hills of California. I just really loved the voice of George's character. I could just hear him in my head. He sounds like cool, but also confident, but still at times insecure. And it was a pleasure to just get to read about him. The book is quite short, but it still feels very full. And I like this sense of George being in control of all the time of his life, whether or not there are certain moments where he doubts himself. And I saw the movie as well when I was in high school, when I was much more pretentious than I am now. But the movie is also quite good, so I would recommend that as well. Sadly now, retreating back into the territory of books I didn't quite like as much these past couple of months. And one of those is Accustomed Earth by Jhumpa Lahiri. And I honestly don't have a lot to say about this. It's just another short story collection. I've read Interpreter of Maladies by Lahiri last year, which I really loved, one of my favorite short story collections. But this one, they're much longer, the stories themselves. I think Lahiri is much better at being concise. I don't think she has to feel like she has to make her stories longer for them to be effective. Eventually, I think what they do is sort of go in circles, or they are written for so long that I feel like I can start to predict what might happen. But yeah, this one just, a lot of these didn't land for me like I wish they would have. So if you're looking to start with Lahiri, I would start with Interpreter of Maladies. Moving on to Augustus by John Williams. This is a historical account of Augustus's reign as Julius Caesar dies, and we follow Augustus throughout his whole life. I think my problem with this book is that I found it too well researched. It ended up at times reading very textbook, although in the second or later half of Augustus, we do start to get more intimacy, where we find out where Augustus is sort of realizing sort of just how full his life was, including all of his mistakes. So there are things, you know, like sex and murder, rumors and stuff, which is interesting when that comes up. But it's not really until towards the end where Augustus is writing these letters to an old friend, sort of thinking about his life now, that sort of emphasizes the tragedy of all these years and how it's at every corner of Augustus's life and how he's starting to feel it all at once. It's even more tragic to the person he's writing to, which I won't spoil. I think what sort of shocked me about reading this, because I thought I would like it a lot more, is that I read Stoner by John Williams a couple years ago, and I really loved that book so much. It's intimate and the writing is beautiful, and it was missing here. I was surprised. I expected more. Up next, I wanted to talk about another historical book, and that is Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. This is the story of the developing relationship between Patroclus and Achilles, who are two characters that Miller was inspired by from the Iliad. And right off the bat, I think what this book does a good job at is it doesn't try to feel like that the theme or quality of this book is based on how revealing or secretive or liberating Achilles and Patroclus's sexuality is. Although there is a lot of physical contact, it doesn't feel like it's about that. I think if anything, the sort of overwhelming theme of Song of Achilles is a sense of pride, and how pride is sort of your default feeling that you have to work with in the face of things like war and death, for sure, but just sort of not only the external pride, but just also, you know, your internal, your selfishness, your stubbornness, your ways of communicating. I think that's what Miller is really trying to get at. Otherwise, I feel like Miller accidentally sacrifices the quality of writing in this book. That's my biggest beef. It's just, I don't think this book is written very well. It's very like point A to point B. It's not hard to really interpret anything going on. And I don't mean like the sexuality or how that's explored or anything. I don't think it has to be complex to be worthwhile. I think the sort of overextendedness comes from getting Patroclus's and Achilles their relationship from beginning to end. I don't think that's entirely necessary, although the last 50 pages or so of this book does something really interesting with how that all happens. But yeah, I don't really get the hype with this book. It just wasn't for me. And so now we are in the Jane Austen segment of this wrap-up. In my Friday reads, I did mention that I read Persuasion by Jane Austen, and this is the story of Anne. As we find Anne, she's broken off her engagement with Mr. Wentworth. I know I mentioned briefly in my Friday reads that I wasn't really compelled by this book. I had just read Pride and Prejudice, so I felt like Pride and Prejudice was up here and Persuasion was down here. But now that I've stepped away a bit, I really appreciate Persuasion more. I think it does a really great job at hitting home the idea of moving on and seeing our past not as examples of our failure, but as examples of opportunities to grow. Apart from Anne, we do have other characters that also experience the sense of failure, especially what might seem like failure you can't move forward from, like the death of a loved one or very heavy financial strain. But these characters find solace in things like poetry, and just things that make them happy that they didn't realize. And so Persuasion is a very optimistic book. Of course, things end happily, but still, it's a very wholesome feeling. This book also features one of my favorite scenes in literature, where a character by the name of Louisa jumps off the side of a wall and knocks herself unconscious. And then I think she wakes up to finding out someone's wanting to be engaged with her. Although a Jane Austen character that I might say would never jump off the side of a wall to knock herself unconscious accidentally would be Fanny Price from Mansfield Park. And this is a book that really surprised me. It's a book I really enjoyed. Fanny Price, who is very meek and shy, or at least in comparison to her cousins, finds herself moving from Portsmouth to Mansfield Park to live with her uncle. And I think this book ultimately is truly about selective experience. And even if you choose different pathways in life that don't muster up to the quality or decisions that your peers or even your family make, it's still valid and it's still you. Even if people insist or are confused by you, as many characters are confused by Fanny. Specifically, as she moves in with her uncle, she's with her cousins and their extended friends and people they know, and they do this really, another wholesome thing, like try to conduct a play. And plays are like the perfect hotspot of sort of role-playing and figuring out who you want to be and things like identity, and being able to sort of adapt and foster these characteristics that might not be your own. But of course, Fanny, she's still this girl on the sidelines, sort of watching these other people sort of partake in the fun of being in a play. But all of it sort of comes to a halt anyway as Sir Thomas comes home and finds everyone sort of enjoying themselves. It's just, to me, really cute through this whole play part of this book, how everyone seems to have this little hint of confidence and feeling secure in the roles that they're assigned to play, while also mixing in their own desires for each other and other people. And little do they know that with Fanny, it's her own sense of doing that as well, choosing to be more on the sidelines. And especially whenever, eventually with other events in the book, how it's okay and it's just as powerful to be someone that's observant, even if you're not as memorable. And while it may not be, I would say, as witty as Pride and Prejudice, I do think Mansfield Park is definitely just as sharp. While we have Fanny Price as our main character, I would say it's just as equal, or the spotlight is shared with the other characters as well. I think they really rely on each other in a good way. I think it makes them, in a way, better people or figure out things more independently and for themselves. Mansfield Park, people are sleeping on it, so you should read it. And what I think is perhaps the most timeless book that I read between April and May, also another classic that is beloved, is Middlemarch by George Eliot. And this is truthfully just a book about an examination of a different slew of characters. Of course, taking place in the Victorian era, you might expect that this would be about things like class and your occupation, and it certainly is. Although ultimately, I think this book does a great job at sort of balancing the scale of humanity and humility. We have characters like Dorothy, who is someone that has such a very passionate curiosity towards life. And then we have people like Dr. Lydgate, who is someone that's more of a man of science and research. But even then, these characters, they do things that are so perhaps unexpected, or for example, with Dr. Lydgate, someone that's so well researched, there's a moment where he looks at someone and realizes, sure, I might love this person, but the idea that I can protect someone and be that person for someone that loves me just as much. I love that scene so much. It's, when you read it, when you get there, it's so intimate, not even just between the two characters, but so internal. It's quite mesmerizing, and it really stuck with me for some reason. And little did I know, beyond that, there would be many more moments like this, where characters have these sort of mini epiphanies, but it's so quiet and understated. And this is propelled so well by our omniscient narrator, who we don't ever find out who that is, but sort of leads us along through these characters and their lives. And like I said, Middlemarch is just a study of all of them and how they intersect, even in the smallest ways. But even then, it doesn't have to be anything entirely groundbreaking. Even then, I don't think Middlemarch is necessarily any type of literary phenomenon, but I do think it is something well crafted, very well loved by George Eliot, and something I think any reader can enjoy, truthfully. I think it's something so genuine, and I just love it so much. I can't wait to reread it in years to come. Up next, we have another classic that is neither wholesome or peaceful, and that is Master and Margarita. If I could describe this book just as like simplest way as possible, it's really just these mysterious occurrences between characters that's likely at the suspicion of the work of the devil. The satire really hits hard in this book, anywhere between materialism, morality, and also the use of language, which is so much fun. I've never had quite as much of a fun reading experience as I have had with reading this book. So because of all the hijinks in this book, the sense of believability might be a bit warped, where a lot of readers might find it disorienting. If you treat it like a roller coaster, it's quite fun, but given that sense of believability, it sort of enhances sort of the craziness of what happens to certain characters or how certain scenes are written. And so, for example, whether that be catching money that falls from the sky and falling prey to your own selfishness of humanity, you get punished for that. But then if you try to pursue the truth and it really feels like the characters trying to seek out why everything is happening are the ones that are trying to make narrative and how we understand it through books and text sort of back to normal, which the work of the devil, it's so much fun how it's like the language, the text matches sort of the kookiness and the nuance of how all the events are unfolding. So even if we have parts where a character might be hit with a piece of chicken, or someone is so shocked that they say, "The devil take me," and then the devil's like, "Okay." This book, I think, is all about living life with intention and really, being confident in that. If you make a decision, make it. Your choices are your own, and it's up to you to live your life how you want. So now moving on to our Allie Smith section of this wrap-up, I've read Hotel World. And this book, it has a lot of things about it, although primarily I would say the pivotal moment is starting out with a girl named Sarah that dies in a dumbwaiter accident in this hotel, as her sister Claire tries to sort of obsess and wonder about her sister's death. This is Allie Smith's, one of her very early novels, if not possibly maybe her first novel, but it has all classic Allie Smith stuff that would come in later books. So immediately this idea of the body versus the spirit, as when Sarah dies, her ghost lingers over her body and tries to talk to her. We also have the interconnected storylines and sort of this large, heavy thematic quality. Even when you look up Hotel World and what it's about, it will tell you that each section of this book, where there's 4 sections, they're about the different stages of grief. And so I think Allie Smith, what she does so well is she crafts these characters that are so specific and unique, but she's always working towards this sort of larger narrative within these smaller ones, not just because the stories are a bit severed between these different viewpoints, but because it is consistent. There is consistency, I would say. That's a way to describe Allie Smith. There's a consistent layer of what she's trying to say, while also a good dose of mischief. If you've never read Allie Smith, I think Hotel World would actually be a great starting point. I don't think it's very good in comparison to her later works. She's clearly grown, but it's still an enjoyable read. For example, one Allie Smith book that I read within these past couple months is There But For That, and I really liked this book. I think it might be my favorite Allie Smith. This is a story about a man named Miles who locks himself in a room while going to someone's party, and then he never leaves that room for days. So if we're looking at this situation, let's call the house just life in general, and then the room in the house is just space. And so I saw this book as just a way of saying how people take up space in our lives in different rooms of ourselves, even if we can't see them, or sometimes we literally forget they're there, or for how long, they're still there for a reason, and how a thought is its own form of existence. And I think this might be, Allie Smith's most playful book. I think it's just so much fun. The whole idea of a dinner party and then this happening. And then we have younger characters, which is also another very common part of Allie Smith's book, is having this young character that seems to be the key to everyone's situation, that youth is the answer. And this child's name is Brooke. And of course, with Ellie Smith's books, like, there is this sort of layer of like pretension as well. That's what I feel when I read the books, at least. There's a funny part where even all the adults are having this conversation at the dinner party, and then Brooke is falling asleep. So Ellie Smith likes to poke fun at herself as well. The book also starts off by saying the fact is, and so already Smith is ready to sort of challenge that notion that life is still full of surprises and quite often just very unexpected all the time. And finally, the last Ellie Smith that I've read recently is Spring, and this is a story of a couple of stories actually. We have a man named Richard, and Richard is a bit lost in thinking about or preferring to retreat inside his own memories about this old collaborator friend that he knew or knows. And he's very much living in the past, and he's not very proactive in his current life. And then we have Brittany, who works in this detention center for migrants, and she is just a bit cynical, and she doesn't really enjoy life, I would say, too much, not until she meets this younger girl named Florence, who sort of like opens her up to the idea of life. And so again, immediately, just like Brooke in There But For The, we have Florence, who's sort of the key for everyone to feel like there are these possibilities or a sense of possibility. As usual, being a part of the seasonal quartet that Smith is working on, Spring also does have its sense of the political, although I would say Spring is the most effortless with how she does it. I think no matter what, Smith is definitely a writer that wants you to work for her rewards with her writing and sort of what she's talking about. Spring, I think, is the easiest to read, and I think it's the most clear. But yeah, it's just so effortless how she does it all. I think, again, no matter what, she has such a belief in the future generations and young people, despite how she talks about technology all the time and sort of where we're at right now. She does have this sort of optimism about what we can do with that technology and how information is power. The second to last book I have here is Days of Abandonment by Elena Ferrante, and this is a story about a woman really just living her life and trying to feel okay about it. This woman is a wife and a mother, and I think initially she tries to get past the guilt of feeling sort of burdened by both of those roles, but then eventually, whether it be sort of yelling at her kids due to certain situations that happen here, or fighting most often with her husband and even trying to put shards of glass, I think, in his spaghetti. What I can describe Elena Ferrante as, or at least with how she writes characters, is that they're always so uncompromising. Her characters are always so sure of themselves, without it ever feeling like they're stubborn, although you work your way up to that feeling eventually about them, but you root for them. You always wonder what they're going to do next, and she does such a good job at convincing you that these characters are above moral, that they're sort of lawless in their own way. And so if you've read Days of Abandonment, I think it's a great taste of sort of what might have been a scene or a storyline in the My Brilliant Friend series, but it feels almost like a draft of that because Days of Abandonment was written before. So I would read Days of Abandonment as sort of a taste to Ferrante to see if you like her, and then I would move on to the My Brilliant Friend series if you're interested, which is also an amazing series. And finally, the last book we have here is Where Reasons End by Yiyun Li. I thought this was appropriate to be the last book to talk about in this wrap-up since we're at the end here. Also, because like Days of Abandonment, Where Reasons End does also feel very uncompromising, because it's a story about this mother who unfortunately has lost her son to suicide, and how she sort of manages her grief is coming up with these conversations by talking to him or his ghost. This is largely inspired by Yiyun Li's personal life, as her son did commit suicide, although this is a fictional account of how she sort of is processing that. So she never deliberately calls herself in this book, but it's very much implied. And what I love so much about this book, I thought it was amazing. I think this is such a good book at making people feel okay that if you ever live through life with this unfortunate experience where you know someone that's committed suicide, your grief is still always your own. You don't have to feel like you're giving a manual for people to learn how to feel after sad circumstances like this one. The conversations themselves between this mother and her son that they have, they're always so surprising. They always feel like it's a snowball rolling down a mountainside, just getting bigger and bigger. And it never dissipates. It just always feels very desperate in its own way, how she knows talking to her son this way is the only way she can try to understand things, not only himself, but also herself, and how she can move on. There are also lovely, playful sentiments towards language and how powerful language is to sort of communicate the idea of loss and grief. And there's even a part about talking about eulogy, and even just the whole concept of ceremony and having funerals and things like that. What does it all mean, and how did we get there? And how are feelings continuing to evolve and be expressed in future years to come. This is the first Yiyun Li that I've read. I'm so excited to read more of her work in the future. So those are all the books that I read in April and May. If you've read these, absolutely please let me know what you think. Or if you're interested in any of these books that I did talk about, I would love to know that as well. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.